Real historical cases when people were buried alive and they slowly died in a coffin. A few centuries ago, the idea that they could be buried alive was such a mass phenomenon that special devices with a bell were produced so that the deceased who woke up in the coffin could ring and be dug up. In that era, medicine was not so developed, and a deep fainting or coma from an illness could be confused with death, and they were buried much faster in those centuries, since there were no morgues with refrigeration units. And from time to time, when some bodies were exhumed for transfer to another cemetery or for other reasons, all signs were found in the coffin that the deceased had been buried alive. The coffin was scratched from the inside. The body of the deceased froze in a painful pose, and so on. Here are just a few such cases that have actual confirmation and are not just stories. The case of Mrs. Blunden. On July 15, 1674, a resident of Hampshire, Mrs. Blunden, became seriously ill and fell into a deep sleep after being given poppy water. Her body quickly cooled down. Her heartbeat and pulse were not palpable. The woman was declared dead and decided to be buried as soon as possible, contrary to the wishes of her husband, who was away. But soon after the funeral, children playing near the cemetery began to talk about various strange sounds that come from the side of the fresh grave. When the coffin was dug up, they found the body of a woman in it, who clearly woke up in the coffin and realized that she was buried alive. She was trying to open the coffin lid from the inside, and her own body was covered with deep scratches from her own nails. Alas, when the coffin was opened, the woman was already dead. At least that's what she looked like. She had no pulse and no breathing again, and she was declared dead again and buried again. A few days later, the coroner finally arrived in town, and he needed a personal examination of Mrs. Blunden's body, for which the coffin had to be dug up a second time. And when the coffin was opened, they saw that the woman's body looked completely different than after the first exhumation. Now her mouth was cut, she bit it until it bled, and her clothes were badly torn. It was like after the second burial, the woman woke up for the second time and found herself in the coffin again. At the same time, a guard was placed at the grave of the woman after the reburial just in case, but he claimed that he had not heard anything suspicious. This time Mrs. Blunden was indeed dead. The coroner was convinced of this by carefully examining her body. After that, the coffin was buried for the third time and was not dug up again. Nameless girl from South Carolina. This story happened somewhere in the 1850s, when an unnamed girl who came to her family to rest on Edisto Island, South Carolina. Suddenly she got diphtheria. After being ill for several days, the girl fell into a coma and soon looked as if she had died. She had no breathing, no pulse. They decided to bury the child's body as soon as possible, fearing that someone else would get infected from him. And since the girl's parents were rich people, the girl was not just buried in the cemetery, but buried in a large family crypt mausoleum. The door to the mausoleum was heavy and carefully locked with a key. The mausoleum was opened only when a new family member was buried in the crypt. A few years after the girl's death, one of her relatives died and the mausoleum was reopened. People were horrified when they saw a small child's skeleton in a girl's dress at the door of the mausoleum from the back. The girl was lying in a pose, as if she was still trying to open the door, and her coffin was empty with the lid pulled back. Octavia Hatcher. In January 1891, James and Octavia Hatcher from Kentucky lost their only son Jacob due to a serious illness. After his death, Octavia was under a lot of stress and in severe depression. She refused to get out of bed. After lying in bed with tears for several months, Octavia just didn't wake up one day and was declared dead. It happened on May 2, 1891. They buried her hastily, because it was hot and the body could begin to decompose quickly. The cause of her death was declared sleeping sickness. After a while, Octavia's husband began to have doubts. It seemed to him all the time that they had buried a living woman. Finally, James Hatcher could not stand it and ordered his wife's coffin to be dug up. And it turned out that he was right. The lining of the coffin was all tattered, and Octavia's hands were covered in blood from trying to break the coffin boards. Grave James reburied his wife next to the grave of their son Jacob. But then for many years the locals said that muffled screams and groans could be heard from the side of this grave. And judging by the sounds, both the woman and the child are crying. On this double grave, James later installed a beautiful sculpture of a woman with a baby in her arms. And when he himself became old, he was very afraid that he would be buried alive. He ordered to build a special coffin for himself with an opening lid and bury it shallowly in order to get out of the coffin on his own in case of anything. Who gave birth in a coffin. On November 16, 1901, the newspaper The Hereford Times told about the terrible case of Madame Bobin, who died of yellow fever in the city of Pauillac, France, after returning from Senegal. When examined by doctors, the woman's body looked already stiff, and her skin acquired a grayish earthy hue. She was recognized as 100% dead and buried in the cemetery. At the same time, the woman was pregnant for a long time, and the nurse even thought that the baby in the stomach of the deceased moved. However, the doctor did not confirm this guess and signed the documents on the death of Madame Bobin. Nevertheless, the nurse was sure of what she had seen, and she began to be tormented by doubts that they had buried a person alive. After a while she made up her mind and came to Madame Bobin's father, telling him about her doubts. The father of the buried woman immediately ordered her coffin to be dug up and was present at it himself. And when the coffin was opened, he was in the strongest shock when he saw inside the corpse of a baby with the umbilical cord not cut, which was lying between his daughter's legs. It turned out that Madame Bobin really was not dead, but only fell into a coma, and that she did not have yellow fever, but had another disease. When she came to herself in the coffin, she went into premature labor from her experiences, but both she and the baby soon died, suffocating in a cramped coffin. Madame Bobin's father then sued the doctor and won the case, receiving compensation of 8,000 francs. Subscribe to the channel, like and write a comment. See you in the next story.